Well, we're back to the Great Western Steam Up at the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson City, Nevada.
What a fun event.
Holy cow, this was great.
Oh, no kidding.
The Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson, some people might say it's the Virginia and Truckee Museum, just because this was the hub of operations for the Virginia and Truckee, and a lot of the equipment, maybe even the majority of the equipment that they have here at the museum is from the Virginia and Truckee Railroad.
Right.
Before this event, they had even more Virginia and Truckee.
I didn't know there was that much, to be honest.
Well, the two great collections are here at Carson and then in Sacramento at the California State Railroad Museum, and Sacramento sent two of their prize locomotives up here for the event.
And this one is my favorite.
Oh, the McKean car.
That is so unusual and fun.
Oh, these things, the what did they call them? Wind splitter.
Yes.
The wind splitter design. But we've ridden this. They didn't have it out for the show. They had it kind of parked. But this is so fun to ride in.
It is.
Like a lot of really neat pieces of equipment, it got turned into a diner.
Oh my goodness.
But the museum got a hold of it and restored it. These are a couple of doors off of the original Virginia and Truckee engine shop.
Those are neat.
Which was only just a couple of miles here from the museum. This is the original Virginia and Truckee shop. And unfortunately, the whole thing got torn down in the 1990s.
Oh, serious?
This is just barely before it was torn down.
Oh.
And it survived that long, and still somehow it managed to get torn down. Anyway, you can see those are the doors from that original shop on display here at the museum.
That's neat.
That's neat. There's a bunch of other fun artifacts left over from the Virginia and Truckee Railroad, but the neatest stuff is the stuff that they've restored.
Oh, no kidding.
And they've got a lot of really great rolling stock and several locomotives. So it's a really amazing museum. This was an interesting car.
Yes.
And this was a caboose number 9.
Oh, boy.
It doesn't look, but you know, these really early cars sometimes look a little bit different.
They do.
Than their later counterparts. But this is an 1870 version of a caboose. Cabooses back then had to satisfy more needs than just a place for the crew to ride.
Oh.
And they were used for all kinds of things, even hauling horses.
Oh, serious?
So you just never knew what a railroad's needs might be for their caboose at the far end of the train.
I know what I'd use it for, but...
a house?
Yes, my little getaway.
So here's a map of the Virginia and Truckee. And as you can see from the map here, the very center of the railroad was here at Carson City.
Oh.
Which is the state capital.
Right.
Which made a good deal of sense back then because it was the only town of any consequence in Nevada.
For quite a while, I think.
The railroad was built to get the ore out of the mines here at Virginia City. And there was this twisty, windy, horribly steep grade all the way down to this point. And then there was a junction and another line leading up toward Dayton and beyond Dayton where there was good water.
Oh.
And so that's where the mills and smelters had been built.
Right.
There had been an attempt to build a tunnel under the mountain at this point. Well, they built the tunnel, the Sutro Tunnel, to get the ore under the mountain and out to this point. But by the time they built the tunnel, the mines were deeper than the tunnel.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my goodness. Anyway, then the long part of the railroad extended from Carson all the way up to the Central Pacific here on the Truckee River. A lot of people think Truckee means Truckee, California. No, Truckee River at what is now Reno.
Right.
But the little railroad became quite popular, known as the Queen of the Short Lines, in large part because it was so darn profitable.
Oh.
But the railroad really epitomized just about everything you would think of when you said Old West Steam Railroad. Because the railroad was constructed in the early 1870s, well, it has a certain character.
It sure does.
And being a mining railroad up to the crazy wild town of Virginia City, home of Mark Twain.
Yes.
And so it just epitomized what exactly an Old West Railroad should look like.
Yes.
But this was their very first locomotive, and talk about an early design.
Oh, but it's neat.
It's neat.
Oh.
Didn't work very well, so they scrapped it fairly early on.
What?
Which is unfortunate. They had two locomotives, the Ormsby and the Lion, the Lion, that were both scrapped. But a lot of the locomotives were never scrapped, simply because this was such a beautiful Old West railroad that the movie industry promptly moved in.
It figures.
And started using this in TV, later on TV, but early on in movies. This is a locomotive known as the Genoa, and it was painted up as the Jupiter, the Central Pacific Jupiter, for the reenactment of the driving of the Golden Spike in 1969.
Right.
But as early as the 1930s, the railroad was already running special excursions for rail fans.
Oh, neat.
This is 1938.
Wow.
And they're already doing excursions out here behind these early steam engines because people were coming from all over to ride the Virginia and Truckee.
Oh my goodness, look at all those folks. Wow.
So even while steam locomotives were in daily service, this had already become a fun place to visit. Also, modelers started modeling this railroad extensively.
I would.
I would. These are half-inch scale models, scratch-built there at the museum. But a man by the name of Arnaldo Pocher wanted to build a line of trains, Italian trains, and he fell in love with the Virginia and Truckee as well. So his American trains were all based on the Virginia and Truckee.
Oh, that's a good model to base it on, though.
No
Wow.
kidding. And he did two of the locomotives in O-scale. This is an O-scale model. But as much as he enjoyed prototyping these things, he didn't enjoy selling them. So he merged his company with a company called Rivarossi.
Oh,
And went on to make car models
there
instead.
you go.
Now this is maybe the flagship of the railroad. It runs, and it's the only one of the early Virginia and Truckee locomotives that's still operational, the Inyo.
Oh, neat.
But even so, it was a locomotive that was incredibly popular. It is one of the locomotives that Pocher decided to model. And it's been restored here at the museum, and again, they decided to make this one fully operational.
I'm glad they did.
It's fun to have at least one of these really early engines fully operational. They only run it once a year,
Right.
just because, they don't want to damage it. But it's great that once a year they pull out number 22 here and operate it. And then, of course, for special events like this, they fired it up as well. All of these original locomotives on the Virginia and Truckee were wood burners,
Right.
but a large number of them were converted to run on coal and subsequently to run on oil. But this one's been taken back to burn wood, of course, because they want it to be as close to original as it can possibly be.
Right.
I really love the color scheme on these locomotives.
I do too.
And whereas some of these early locomotives, it's very difficult to figure out what the color schemes were, as these locomotives were never retired from the railroad, they were never repainted to any other colors either. So the Inyo here has always looked like this.
Well, that's wonderful.
Well, except for when it was in movies or
oh,
something
sure,
like that.
but I love it.
Now, one of the problems with rebuilding these early locomotives to make them run A lot of times, in order to do that, you would end up throwing away so much of the locomotive that you would be destroying the historic artifact.
Oh, right.
So most of them are just cosmetically restored.
Right.
But fortunately, this one is in good enough condition that they were able to make it fully operational without substantially modifying what they already had.
Right.
Now, this is perhaps the most famous locomotive on the Virginia and Truckee.
It sure is.
Number 12, the Genoa.
Yes.
And it's been modeled so much, and it's just been everybody's favorite locomotive. And it normally resides at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento.
Right.
But they sent it up here for this event, and in fact, they've loaned it to the museum here for 2 years.
Oh, funny.
So if you want to visit this museum for the next 2 years, as I understand it, number 12 will be located here in Carson for the next 2 years.
Oh, that will be so cool.
It's so great to see it here. It's been beautiful at the California State Railroad Museum, where it's displayed on this iron bridge.
Right.
And we've seen it there many times, and it's just always been amazing to see. But now to see it back on its home railroad,
Exactly.
that is just amazing. It's kind of hard to say just what the mystique of number 12 is. It looks so much like the other locomotives here, but for some reason it just encapsulates what the Virginia and Truckee was.
Right.
And to some extent still is.
It still is,
It
yes.
still is.
Yes.
Now here's another fun locomotive. This also came up from the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. This is the Bowker.
Isn't that neat?
It's an unusual engine.
It sure is.
This is another one that Poacher decided to model. It's just a classic and yet a strange locomotive all at the same time.
Right. That is one dainty looking pilot. By the way, what is that strange thing on top of the boiler?
Isn't that unusual?
Uh-huh.
It's a water pump.
A water pump?
A water pump. Occasionally these would be put on steam locomotives, but they function the same way that a water pump functions on a fire wagon.
Oh, I see.
So if you accidentally start a fire, you can put it right back out.
What a good idea.
And in this case, the locomotive was actually used sort of as a fire truck.
Well, that's neat.
But it's just an unusual appliance to see on a steam locomotive.
Sure is.
A fire extinguisher.
There you go.
Now here again, they say this will be on loan for 2 years from the California State Railroad Museum. But I've also heard that there's some negotiation that this may become part of the permanent collection here.
Oh, really?
Well, it fits what's going on here so much better. This is the Virginia and Truckee Museum by all rights, and Sacramento is more of a transcontinental museum, and so there's some talk about trading some of their transcontinental equipment here for the Bowker.
Right.
And that makes a lot of
It
sense.
sure does.
Now, another locomotive that is in the permanent collection here at Carson is number 18, the Dayton.
Oh, neat.
And again, it's just one of these beautiful, classic, early engines. But what makes it really unique is it was built by the Central Pacific
Oh, really?
in Sacramento.
Oh, my goodness.
They were having so much trouble getting locomotives into Sacramento back in the early days before there was a railroad. They built their own
Well, there you go.
for building the Transcontinental Railroad.
Yeah.
And 2 of those locomotives ended up on the Virginia and Truckee.
Well, that's cool.
And this is one of those. Notice the big decorative plaque underneath the boiler there. Instead of being the standard Baldwin decorative plaque, It is the Central Pacific logo.
Oh, I like that.
And isn't that neat to think they just built this right there at the shops in Sacramento?
Neat craftsmanship.
Neat. And it turned out to be the most powerful locomotive on the Virginia and Truckee.
Oh, my goodness.
So go figure.
There it is.
And this is number 25.
Oh, yes.
It's a 10-wheeler.
It is. That's so cool.
Doesn't it look a lot like the 40 at the Nevada Northern?
It sure does.
It's very similar
Very
locomotive,
similar.
a Baldwin 10-wheeler. By Virginia and Truckee standards, this is one of their modern engines because it's 20th century.
There you go.
But they had 3 of these. And super workhorses did a lot of the heavy lifting on the railroad in the 20th century.
Right.
And these other engines, while they were still being used, the heavy lifting was all being done by these 10-wheelers. And just as these locomotives were doing the heavy lifting toward the end of the Virginia and Truckee, they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting here at the Nevada State Railroad Museum as well.
They sure are.
25 is just such a workhorse. When they do normal steam operations, 25 is the locomotive that they use for that. Because they want to go easy on 22. 25, they'll fire that up all summer long.
Oh, neat.
Because it's quite indestructible. So in the early part of the 20th century, again, the Virginia and Truckee bought 3 of these, and 25, 26, and 27. And while some of the earlier locomotives were still operational right up to the very end in the 1950s when the railroad was closed down, these 3 locomotives were the mainstay.
Right.
Unfortunately, number 26 burned up in Reno when the engine shops there caught fire.
Oh, sad.
And so they scrapped number 26 out. But 25 and 27 both exist.
That's awesome.
Isn't that neat?
That is just wonderful.
And 25 is fully operational. And again, it's the backbone of operations here at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. Number 27 is also here at the museum, but we didn't see it at the steam up. And normally it would be on display in the main building, but we didn't see it. And so I have no idea where they've put it, but it's probably been sent somewhere for work.
Oh, maybe.
If anyone knows, feel free to jump into the comments. Now, this was fabulous to see. This is number 11, the Reno.
Yes.
And this is maybe the best known Virginia and Truckee engine because it was used in excursion service in the 1930s and 40s. And it ended up going to a movie studio, subsequently ending up at the old Tucson movie studio, where it's just been languishing out in the desert for decades.
Oh my gosh.
And everybody's been saying, something's got to be done with number 11, the Reno. I mean, it's just such a wonderful classic piece of the Virginia and Truckee to be just falling apart out in the sun there. But here it is in the heyday when number 11 was one of the mainstays. It was just a very powerful engine. It was converted to run on oil very early on, and it was so reliable that it continued in operation right up to the very end in the 1950s. It must have really been something to see a locomotive from 1870s still working freight in the 1950s.
Imagine that.
But it was sent off to work in movies, and then, as I say, it just ended up there in Tucson, and people have been saying, you've got to bring it back. Somehow it's got to be brought here to the museum in Carson. Something's got to be done to get it away from the film studio in Old Tucson. Anyway, the amazing thing has happened. It has been purchased by the Virginia and Truckee Railroad.
That is so awesome.
And they're going to start running it on the Virginia and Truckee again.
Oh, really? Good deal.
Oh, that is amazing.
That is wonderful.
Now, this is an unusual piece, and we're going to do a show on this later. This is the lion.
Oh, it is?
Well, I know it got scrapped out.
Yes.
So how is it that the lion is here? Well, one of the fans of the railroad decided that he was going to rebuild it.
Well, that's interesting.
So he started building this thing from the ground up years ago.
My name is Stan Gentry. I am from Clear Lake, Iowa. I built the Virginia and Truckee Lion replica starting in about 1989.
Anyway, as I say, we're going to do a whole show on this because this is just too amazing that Stan has decided to build this locomotive, and he's now donated it to the museum.
Wow.
And they're going to finish it.
What a story.
What a story. So this will be part of the collection here in Carson City. But isn't it amazing that there are so many fans of the Virginia and Truckee, this tiny little railroad, that people will even come up with the idea of completely rebuilding one of the missing locomotives.
Well, that's just awesome. It's really interesting, though.
Isn't it?
Oh, wow.
And, as we mentioned, the Virginia and Truckee is going to start operating the Reno, which is to say the Virginia and Truckee still operates.
Yeah, that's right.
It was shut down for a number of years, and then the track was relayed, and it's back operating as a scenic line. So we'll do a show on that, too.
Right. We've got to get back out there, too, at some point.
We do. Anyway, with all these fun shows coming up, you don't want to miss any of them. So if you're not a subscriber, you want to become a subscriber, and you want to click on your little notification bell so you will be notified when we upload these subsequent shows. And the easy way to become a subscriber is by clicking on the upcoming blue button right there. The blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday with some Tuesday goofing around. Bye-bye.
See you, bye.